Edinburgh Castle sits proudly on top of Castle Rock, an extinct volcano. There have been various settlements on top of this famous rock, dating back as early as 900 BC. At the beginning of the 12th century, during the reign of David I, the royal residence was moved to Edinburgh. King David started a serious rebuild of the castle in 1130. During the rebuild, St Margaret's Chapel was built, which still stands to this day as the oldest building in Edinburgh. St Margaret's Chapel was built in honour of David's mother, who died of a broken heart when her husband, Malcolm II, died in battle. During the Middle Ages, there were endless independent battles in Scotland which affected the castle in various ways. One of these was in 1174 against the English. King William I was captured and forced to sign a peace treaty which meant Henry II of England gained power over Scotland. The terms of said agreement meant that 4 Scottish castles were to fall to the English crown, Edinburgh being one of them. In 1198, Scotland gained back its independence when Richard the Lionheart sold Scotland back its land for 10,000 marks because he needed the money for his Third Crusade. The castle remained in relative peace for more than 100 years until 1296. Then King Edward I of England had a desire for gaining control over Scotland. A siege started which lasted several days and gave England the results they wanted. After taking control of the castle, a huge part of valuables and documents were sent south to England. A brutal period of English rule led to a rebellion during which the English were defeated in the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Just 1 year later, Edward I recaptured Scotland again during the Battle of Falkirk. After the death of Edward, the guard over Scotland was decreased, which led to an event which became legendary for Edinburgh. On the 14th of March 1314, 300 soldiers climbed up Castle Hill, took the guards by surprise and took back control of the castle. The King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce, ordered the defences of Edinburgh Castle to be destroyed to stop the same reoccupation happening with other enemies. In 1333, another English king decided to conquer Scotland by taking over its lands. Edinburgh Castle was effortlessly taken over by the English in 1335. The Scottish yet again regained the castle thanks to William Douglas, who disguised himself as a merchant, got to the castle and helped a small force get inside the castle walls. The small force rendered the guards useless and brought in a bigger force. However, after the Independence War ended in 1357, David II was released and returned to his native Scotland. He made Edinburgh Castle a royal residence. David's Tower was added, which was the most magnificent building for that period. David's Tower was originally the main entrance, but due to expansions of the castle, this has changed. During the reign of Robert II, the Constable's Tower was added and the old St Margaret's Church was renovated. In 1384, the cannon was introduced, which was a great event at that time. Later in the 15th century, Edinburgh became the Scottish capital, which resulted in the Royal Palace and many other structures being built. In 1457, James II was given the Mons Meg cannon, and in 1511, the Great Hall was added to the castle. At the beginning of the 16th century, Holyrood Palace was built near the castle. The road leading up to it, due to its length, was called and is still known today as the Royal Mile. One of the most tragic events of the castle's history was the Lang Siege in 1571, which went on till 1573. This lasted many months and the castle was severely damaged. For example, David's Tower and Constable's Tower were destroyed. Soon after the siege was ended, the rebuilding of the castle began. Over several years, new fortifications were built, constructing a half-moon battery and many other features added on. In 1637, the first rebellion broke out due to upset caused by church reforms implemented by Charles I. Civil war broke out and the castle was taken over by the Covenanters. In 1640, the supporters of Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell himself, revolted against King Charles I, which resulted in his death and the end of the war. May 1650, the Covenanters joined Charles II against the members of Parliament, and as a result, Cromwell marched with his forces against Scotland. After a 3-month-long siege, the governor of the castle surrendered to Cromwell. From that time until 1923, the castle served as a garrison fortress under many rulers, and the army were permanently stationed there. Since then, however, the castle's history has been relatively quiet, and it's now a tourist attraction and hosts the most famous event of all every year, known as a military tattoo.
Here in the esplanade of what is behind you or in front of me to be Edinburgh Castle. Now here you'll notice there's a cast iron fountain in the wall. This was commissioned in 1864 to remember all the women that were burned at the stake here for witchcraft. You'll see there's the maiden's head and the siren's head to represent the good that it was believed that they did, but also the siren for the bad, the serpent in the middle to show both sides. Now, when we talk about the witches, good things and bad things, cunning women, maybe looking at what we've got today, they had a touch of postnatal depression or perhaps a little bit of a mental disorder. But all it would have taken all those years ago was for someone to point at you in the street, "She's a witch!" And for that, you would have met, most likely, your death. Here, something that they favoured to do was to put a lady inside a barrel, poke it with sticks, sharp sticks, and roll her down this very hill. If she survived at the bottom, was she a witch? Also, using barrels, what else they did was they drilled holes into a barrel, put the lady inside, sealed the barrel, and threw her into a lock, which would have been just over yonder there. If she drowned, she was innocent. If she survived, she was a witch. Which brings us right here, because in the 15 and the 1600s, witchcraft was high treason, leading to so many women, for what we believe to be over 300, in places like this, Witches' Well in Edinburgh, where they were burned at the stake.
Cannonball House is located on the right hand side as you walk down from the castle esplanade. The building is called Cannonball House due to the fact there is a cannonball embedded in the wall 3/4 of the way up, as you can see. There are two stories of how this cannonball ended up in this wall, one of which is a bit far-fetched. The first story is that the cannonball was fired from the castle in 1745 and it was aimed down towards Holyrood Palace where Bonnie Prince Charlie was in residence. The other story of why it was here is that it was placed here by engineers to mark the precise height above sea level.
St Giles Cathedral was founded in the 1120s. It was the church of John Knox during the Reformation. From the 14th century it was under constant construction up to the 16th century. Alterations were made to the church in the 19th and 20th century. It served multiple congregations and a section was also used as a prison. Named after St Giles, the patron saint of lepers, it has been the site of many important events including services of the Order of the Thistle. It holds a prominent position on the Royal Mile, sitting on the south side of the High Street and Main Street of the Old Town. The area immediately south of the building was originally the kirkyard, where up until 1561 was the main burial site in the town. After it was full to capacity, the now famous Greyfriars became the site of burials. Despite its name, St Giles Cathedral is not a cathedral. The title gives an idea of its magnificent scale, but was only strictly correct for 2 short periods, when bishops served in the Scottish Church from 1633 to 38 and from 1661 to 89. A visit to St Giles is a fascinating experience. In part, this is due to its unusual layout. On the face of it, you find all the elements you'd normally expect to find in a Scottish church. The western part comprises a nave, and to its east is the choir, or chancel, where the two meet is the crossing supporting the tower, while to the north and south of the crossings are transepts. These were 3 significant changes to St Giles in the 1900s. Between 1909 and 1911, a chapel for the Knights of the Thistle, designed by Sir Robert Lorimer, was added at the south-east corner of the church. The Thistle Chapel measures just 37 feet by 18 feet, but is extremely richly decorated in the 1980s. The focus of St Giles was moved from the east end of the chancel to the crossing under the tower. In 1992, the truly magnificent organ occupying the south transept was installed, complete with its 4,000 pipes.
The heart of Midlothian. Near St Giles Cathedral, you will find a cobblestone heart on the ground. The heart marks the spot where the public once paid their taxes. It was an administration centre. That particular location was also used as a brutal execution site and a prison. The heart marks the exact spot where the prison entrance was, but now there are brass markers that show the building's old outline. The prison, known as the Old Toll Booth, dates back to the 14th century. The conditions were shocking and vile, dark and damp. They would have been unbearable and terrifying. All prisoners were kept inside, from cold-blooded killers to petty thieves, but also innocent people would have been imprisoned there. The Toll Booth prison went hand in hand with a scaffold, where prisoners would be taken to be publicly ridiculed, tortured or executed. The heads and bodies were then displayed nearby and used as a deterrent to future criminals. Due to the state of the prison, Mary Queen of Scots stepped in and a new Toll Booth prison was built. The prison was eventually shut down in 1817. Nowadays, you may see a Scottish person spitting on the heart. The tradition derives from the atrocities that took place there and the disgust for them. But over time, people would say that it was a gesture of good luck. The spitting on the heart is now a part of modern folklore and ritual.
Parliament Square. Parliament Square is named after Parliament House, which was built in 1641 on the site of the old graveyard of St Giles Cathedral. Under Plot 23 is the gravesite of John Knox. It is still unclear whether the body is actually under there or not. The bodies from the graveyard were moved to Greyfriars, but maybe John Knox was too important to move. There are a number of historic landmarks at Parliament Square. The Mercat Cross, the equestrian statue of Charles II of Scotland, the Queensberry Memorial to the 5th Duke of Buccleuch, the Adam Smith statue, and the statue of James Braidwood. Mercat Cross. Mercat is an old Scots word for market. A Mercat Cross marked a town as having the royal charter or licence to hold a market. Having this licence allowed the towns to impose taxes. The Mercat Cross was an emblem of the town's status. The cross would have marked the central point of the old town. People would gather here to do trade. Public proclamations were made here, and also punishments of criminals would have been read out here. The Mercat Cross originally stood in the middle of the Royal Mile. It now sits in Parliament Square, next to St Giles. The old location is marked out with cobblestones on the road. The crosses were often built of a similar style. Generally, they were 8-sided structures. Mercat crosses either have a cross or unicorn on top. The unicorn is the national animal of Scotland. The emblems around Edinburgh's Mercat Cross represent districts and institutions in the city. There is a second cross called the St John Cross inside Canongate Kirk.
Just up from the roundabout at the foot of the Canongate is another circle of bricks on the road. This circle marks the site of the Guth Cross. This cross consisted of a 3-step base with a pillar on top. The Guth Cross also marked the outer limit of sanctuary provided by the nearby Holyrood Abbey. The Guth Cross, like many other crosses around Edinburgh, was a place for public proclamations, civic and trading activities. However, this cross was different as it was also an execution site. One of the most famous public executions to take place here was of a young lady called Lady Warrington in July 1600. She was convicted of the murder of her husband John Kincaid of Warrington, and she was beheaded by the Maiden, which was an early version of the guillotine. During its use, it claimed over 150 victims, one being the famous Regent James Douglas, who had ironically introduced the Maiden to Scotland from France. It can still be seen to this day in the Museum of Scotland in Chambers Street in Edinburgh.
Dunbar's Close is located at the Canongate end of the Royal Mile. The close is thought to have been named after Edinburgh writer David Dunbar. David also owned tenements on both sides of the close in 1773. The close is easy to walk past without even giving it a second thought, even though at the bottom of the close you will find a beautiful 17th century styled garden.
Highland Tolbooth Kirk. The Highland Tolbooth Kirk, now named the Hub, was a Church of Scotland building. It is a 19th century Gothic-styled building. It was built by Augustus Pugin and James Gillespie Graham. The building originally housed the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. The Highland Tolbooth Kirk was built using dark sandstone to make it appear older than it is. It was built between 1842 and 1845. The spire is the highest point in Edinburgh. It stands at 72 metres high. The Church of Scotland used it as a meeting place until 1929. After this, it was used by various groups until 1979, when it closed. It reopened in 1999 after a conversion and remodel as the Hub. It is now a multifunctional space where events are held. It is also the location of the ticket office of the Edinburgh International Festival. There is also a cafe and restaurant inside.
The original Canongate toll booth was built in 1591. The building was used to divide the Royal Borough of Canongate and Edinburgh. Originally the building was the public entrance to the Borough of Canongate where tolls were collected. It was also used as a council chambers, police offices and a prison. The building was constructed for Sir Lewis Belled and the Justice Clerk for the Borough and his initials can still be seen over the archway to Tollbooth Wine to this day. As the Canongate's main public building, it was designed to look impressive. The tower, which stands over Tollbooth Wine, has small turrets and gun loops to give it a sense of ancient battlements. The ground floor was the prison, mainly used for those unable to pay fines for minor crimes. Occasionally it was used to hold people on behalf of the government. During the 17th century, some of the Covenanters were held here, accused of treason. There were several escape attempts at the prison. In 1654, Oliver Cromwell's guards captured the enemies of Scotland and held them at the prison. The prisoners managed to escape using blankets to lower themselves out of the prison. In 1684, 10 prisoners managed to escape by breaking into the house next door. By the 18th century, the jail was used mainly by debtors. It was said that the better sorts are commonly taken to this prison, which is well aired. Some had some decent rooms and is kept relatively clean. By 1856, the borough of Canongate was joined onto Edinburgh to create one big town. And then in 1875, the city's architect Robert Moreham started renovations. Robert's goal was to restore the toll booth to its original appearance while adding touches of his own. The biggest change was the addition of the clock in 1884. Today, half the building is a pub called the Tollbooth Tavern, and the other half is the People's Story Museum.
John Knox House, located halfway down the Royal Mile, is a quaint 16th century house with parts dating back to the 1470s. The house gets its name from the Presbyterian preacher John Knox. Whether John Knox stayed here is a historical mystery, but it was a short time before his death in 1572. In fact, it was a man on the other side of the political table who stayed here. The house originally belonged to Walter Reed Pass, who transferred it to his daughter. She then gave it to her son, who in turn gave it to his daughter, Mariota. In 1556, Mariota Aris and her wealthy husband, goldsmith James Mossman, developed the house into their home. Their coat of arms and initials still decorate the outside of the house. Mossman was a confirmed Catholic and supporter of Mary Queen of Scots. He found himself caught up in the religious turmoil of the time. In 1753, following the surrender of Mary's supporters, he was arrested for treason and hanged at Market Cross. In the 1840s, the building next to John Knox House split. This was due to faulty foundations. The house was nearly destroyed, but due to its association with Knox, it was saved. The house was renovated and opened as a museum in the mid-19th century, and it is still open to this day.
Netherbow Port. The Netherbow Port was a large gatehouse with towers and a fence that stood between the High Street and Canongate. The gates along the old city walls enclosed the city. Anyone from the Canongate and beyond would have to pay to enter. Unfortunately, for poorer residents within the city, they were forced to stay inside, as the payment to return would have been too expensive. As a result of this, the area became known as the World's End, as for many a poor resident, they were left and simply died without ever seeing the land beyond the walls. Among the Netherbow Port, the heads of executed prisoners from the old toll booth were displayed on the spikes of the gate to deter criminals. The port was demolished in 1764. Now, the outline of the old gate's perimeter is marked with brass cobbles.
Queensberry House. Around 1667, the first house was built on this site for Margaret Douglas of Balmakelly. The building was modified and expanded in the years following. In 1686, it was bought by the first Duke of Queensberry as his magnificent Edinburgh residence. The new Queensberry House would have been one of the grandest in this area. If we look at the records, it shows the house had 52 rooms, each one with its own fireplace, and it has an extensive, impressive formal garden. The Duke of Queensberry was heavily involved in the Act of Union from 1707. Except this house comes with a horrific tale. Whilst the Duke was out, his criminally insane son escaped from his room. When the Duke returned, he was faced with an horrific sight. His son had roasted a young kitchen boy in the spit
and the roast in the kitchen. The Duke arrived just as his son was beginning to munch on the young boy's flesh. During the 18th century, the house was divided up into apartments and slowly moved from a private residence to a more public space and public use. In the early 19th century, Queensberry House became a hospital and then a barracks, and in 1834 it became a house of refuge for the poor. Over time, other facilities were built, such as a women's infirmary, a small men's infirmary, night shelters with food provisions, and even a soup kitchen. In 1937 alone, Queensberry House provided shelter for 6,627 people and an impressive 14,183 meals. It was also an elderly hospital in 1945. And finally, in 1997, Queensberry House was bought by the Scottish Government to be part of the new Parliament building.
Anchor Close dates back to 1521. The close gets its name from the Anchor Tavern in Fuller's Close. There is a sign in the close which reads Anchor Tavern House to Crocallan Fencibles. The close was also the site of Smelly's printing house, where the works of Robert Burns were printed, and the first ever edition of the Britannica Encyclopedia. And Sir Walter Scott's parents resided here until 1771.
Along the Royal Mile you will find 4 wellheads, situated at the Lawn Market, High Street, Netherbow and Canongate. Not all of the wellheads have the original heads still present. Until 1820, these stone wellheads were the only means of water for thousands of residents. Wellheads also provided places where the locals would meet up to gossip. During summer months, the council would ration the water, would only allow people to collect water between midnight and 3 AM. This caused a lot of worry for the residents, as they may not be able to get water. This also meant that there were massive queues and often fights would break out. The water would be collected using narrow-necked buckets called stoups. If you were from the upper-class families, you would have been able to pay a caddy who would collect and deliver your water for you. The caddies had a purpose-built barrel which strapped to their back. The source of the water was from the Castle Hill Reservoir. The reservoir was fed by the springs and streams from the Pentland Hills. At the top of the Canongate section of the Royal Mile, on the north side you will find a small statue high up on a building. The statue is of a small Moorish fellow who is wearing a turban and a necklace. The story goes that a young Edinburgh man called Andrew Gray was sentenced to death for rioting. He fled to Morocco, where after a few years he made his fortune. He eventually returned to Edinburgh and saved the life of the daughter of the provost, who was ill with the plague. As a result of saving her, he was pardoned of his crime. He ended up marrying the young lady, and they made a home out of the building where the statue sits. This set of buildings became known to the locals as Morocco Land.
Thank you for watching. We look forward to bringing you part 2, Darkest Death.